to children's rights. So I represent Affirm Foundation Malaysia, and we have been working in the palm oil supply chain for the past 10 years. Our focus has been on enabling environmental and social transformation, and we do that by working with the estates, the smallholders, the mills, and to support companies to make far-reaching commitments to respect people and nature in their supply chains. Our team carry out assessments, workshops, trainings, and develop tools and resources to tackle challenging issues, including but not limited to child protection in the palm industry. As a father of 2 young girls, I think we all agree that childhood is a special and important time in our lives. It's the phase where we learn about ourselves, the people around us, the society, and the world around us. The way children view their world and their ideas they believe in shapes our future. So that is why we all have responsibilities towards children and in our relationship with them. Let me turn specifically to the theme of this webinar. Oil palm cultivation has been an important generator of income in Malaysia. The industry has uplifted the lives of many, and we owe a lot to it. However, in recent times, we have seen how the industry have been associated with a number of adverse social impacts on children who live in and within the plantations. So some of these children may be vulnerable and are at risk of becoming child labor if their rights are not properly understood and protected. The immense size of the palm oil sector highlights the scale of which we need to grow the awareness of the public and especially plantation companies whom are in a position to make a positive difference. In the years working in this space, we have seen companies making important decisions like building schools, making sure children are taken care of while their parents work, diverting heavy traffic away from housing by building new roads and putting in place policies to prevent child labor. So these efforts must be celebrated and encouraged for it to eventually become normal practice, widespread across the industry. For companies whom still struggle with this topic, this is what this webinar is for. In the next 3 hours, we have the experts to share with us important information to deepen our knowledge and understanding on these matters. We hope to cover applicable legislation, international and industry standards, as well as steps to identify risks in order to improve them. Bridging the gap on knowledge is the first and important step to transformation. So I'm excited to be here with you today and wish everyone a productive and informative webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl, for your opening remarks. Next, we have Ms. Gayatri Raman, the Managing Director of LexisNexis Southeast Asia.
Thanks, Natasha, and thanks, Carl, for a great opening. You've set the stage for all of us and elucidated how important this topic is for us here as well. Distinguished panelists, thank you so much for making time to share your expertise with us and inspire action in our guests. And valued guests, thank you for coming and joining our webinar today. For those of you who know us at LexisNexis, you do know that our corporate mission is to advance the rule of law. And we are very, very passionate committed towards serving that mission with the best that we have to offer. The best projects, honestly, I find are the ones that empower our customers and our friends and our partners to advance the rule of law within their spheres of influence, which means if you can make an impact in your area of expertise, then we move the needle in a huge way. This webinar hopefully is designed to engender that kind of action with all of us. So when we had the opportunity to work with Earthworm sometime last year, we were really, really impressed and inspired, and we immediately saw an opportunity to work on something together. And here we are today. We're starting with this webinar, of course. We were just discussing earlier that it shouldn't end with a webinar, and it should end with a lot of action as well. We, LexisNexis, as a legal content provider, we want to help the legal community navigate compliance, regulatory rules, reputational risks, These can all result in economic and financial repercussions for players in the palm oil industry. But why is today so special? The webinar today, as Carl had said very clearly, is especially important because we will be discussing children. Children are our future. And children, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds, are amongst the most vulnerable in society. And they are less likely to have the protection of the rule of law. We want to change that. In doing so, everyone benefits, not just the children. Do you know, evidence shows that countries with strong rule of law have high GDP per capita, lower rates of child mortality and violent crime, and higher life expectancy rates. In fact, the World Justice Project and other data providers did an analysis, and a 10% increase in the rule of law increases GDP by $6.6 thousand. Just think about that. With that, I hope that you are encouraged to see your work as a lawyer, your work as business people who contribute to society, as one that advances the rule of law. All of us play a role, regardless of your specific role. It is such an important role that we look forward to supporting you in every step of the way. I wish all of you a wonderful session in learning, inspiration, and engendering action. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gayatri. Now we are very pleased to have with us here today to deliver the keynote address, Mr. Lechumanan Shanmugam, Senior Undersecretary in the Strategic Planning and International Division of the Ministry of Plantation, Industries and Commodities, MPIC.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Mr. Carl Quenien, Regional Lead, Earthworm Foundation. Ms. Gayatri Raman, Managing Director, LexisNexis Southeast Asia. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. Very pleased to be with you all and be part of this webinar. First and foremost, I would like to thank the organizers of this webinar for giving this opportunity to the Ministry of Plantation, Industries and Commodities to present this keynote address. I would also like to congratulate the Earthworm Foundation and LexisNexis for this joint effort in conducting a webinar on child rights in the palm oil industry today. I was informed that the objective of these events are to increase the awareness of palm oil producers, companies, that they have the responsibility to ensure their business operation do no harm to children in and around oil palm plantation areas, increase palm oil producers, companies' knowledge and understanding of their legal obligations to comply with the national legislations in Malaysia, market requirements and international standards, increase palm oil producers, companies of their corporate responsibility to respect children's rights, avoiding the infringement of human rights, including children, and addressing any adverse human rights impacts with which the business is involved. Ladies and gentlemen, children's rights in Malaysia have progressed tremendously since Malaysia ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, in 1995, and introduced the Child Act in 2001. Government and civil society initiatives to realize and uphold the rights of children has resulted in significant progress in the field of education and primary health care for children. However, key challenges remain, particularly the issue of child labor, especially in the plantation sector. The Malaysian government has always maintained a firm stand on the issue of child labor. In Malaysia, the working definition follows the Children and Young Persons Employment Act 1966, Act 350, which child is defined as all persons below 15 years age, and young persons are between 15 to below 18 years old. However, this definition is different from the Child Act 2001, which defines children as all who are below 18 years old. The issue of forced labor and child labor, especially in the oil palm plantation sector in Malaysia, is frequently raised and reported by the US State Department, US Department of Labor, and international organizations. In response to these allegations, the employment survey in oil palm plantation in Malaysia was carried out in 2018. And the purpose is to estimate the prevalence of forced labor and child labor in oil palm plantation in Malaysia. This study was actually commissioned by Ministry of Plantation Industry and Commodities, MPIC, and the survey was conducted by Department of Statistics of Malaysia with technical support from the International Labour Organization. The report of the survey was completed in mid-2020, and on 21st October 2020, the Ministry of Plantation Industry and Commodities presented a cabinet paper on the final report of this survey. The cabinet has agreed that the outcome of the final report on the labor situation to be submitted to the US DOR and to be published as a public document. This is a manifestation that the Malaysian government is taking serious action to identify the real issues behind the allegations and committed to find the best solution towards the sustainability of the oil palm industry. For those interested to have a look at this report, it can be downloaded from our MPIC website. Ladies and gentlemen, starting from 2020, the Ministry of Plantation Industries and Commodities, with the support of Malaysian Palm Oil Board, has initiated a roadshow to engage with the plantation players, including the smallholding oil palm businesses. A collaboration between the International Labour Organization, the Ministry of Human Resources, and the Ministry of Home Affairs was established to ensure the information given during roadshows is comprehensive and covers all aspects of labor-related issues. The main objective of the roadshow is to educate the plantation players on the indicators that enable the occurrence of forced and child labor, as well as to prevent them from taking any action that will lead to the prevalence of forced and child labor. After the pandemic started early last year, we have changed the method from roadshows to webinar platforms to reach all the audience. Besides MPIC, the Ministry of Human Resources is currently developing the first National Action Plan on Child Labour in Malaysia. The National Action Plan will comprise of programs to build awareness among the public regarding child labour, protect young workers, and enhance national capacity to eradicate child labour. Malaysia is committed towards Sustainable Development SDG Goals 2030, a United Nations initiative, and makes significant effort to develop a sustainable oil palm sector, supporting the Roundtable for Sustainable Oil Palm, RSPO, and more recently introducing the Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil Scheme. The main purpose of the MSPO is to get the entire industry, large plantations and smallholders to adopt more sustainable practices in the industry. The Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil Certification Scheme covers the sustainable certification of palm oil in Malaysian landscape throughout the supply chain, from the upstream to downstream sectors. It regulates the production of a sustainable palm oil and covers 7 principles. Principle 4 is on social responsibility, health, safety, and child labor is covered under criterion 5 of these principles, which is employment conditions. While the issue of child labor is not so much associated with the estates and plantation players, there's often erroneous perception that child labor is rampant in the smallholder sectors of the palm oil industry, covering both independent and organized smallholders. It is pertinent to note that under MSPO Indicator 5, Principle 4, criterion 3 states that children and young persons are not to be employed or exploited. The minimum age and condition of employment shall comply with local, state, and national laws. I've just outlined some of the efforts taken by the government to protect the rights of the children, especially in the plantation sector. Although government is ultimately accountable for complying with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we all have the responsibility to respect and safeguard the rights of the children. To conclude, I would like to quote a statement from a UNICEF report, which states that the true measure of a nation is how well it attends to its children, their health, safety, and material security, their education and socialization, and their sense of being loved, valued, and included in the families and societies into which they are born. With that, I would once again applaud and congratulate the organizers of this webinar and sincerely hope that the session today will enlighten all participants on this issue of children's rights. I would also like to encourage everybody to actively participate and engage in the discussion to enable us to understand better about children's rights in palm oil industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lechumanan, for your address and highlighting the government's commitment to child rights. Thank you also, Gayatri and Carl, for setting the stage and highlighting the importance of this issue in the palm oil context. Now, before we begin our first session, our panelist session, if you do have any questions for our panelists, please do share them by clicking on the Q&A function that you will see at the bottom of your screen. And do indicate if your question is for a specific speaker or for the panel generally. The panelists will endeavour to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the session, but we will also be trying to keep to time, so we do apologise in advance if we're unable to address all the queries that come through. So in this first session, we have the privilege of hearing some of the realities facing children in and around plantations from Dr. Catherine Rivai, founder and director of the Etania schools in Sabah. These schools support almost 1,000 children in 11 learning centres. Originally from New Zealand, Dr. Catherine has been living in Sabah for the last 43 years. After Dr. Catherine's session, we have Ms. Kamini Viswanathan of Insight Consultancy, who will be sharing on international standards. Kamini is a litigation lawyer by profession, specialising in industrial relations and employment law. She previously worked with the RSPO as Human Rights and Social Standards Manager. Now over to you, Dr. Catherine.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for the introduction. And it's my pleasure, so excited to meet you all here today to talk about children on plantations. Etania schools began in 2009, and you can see in our next slide that we are dealing with undocumented, stateless, and marginalized children in Sabah. These children have a right to an education. We try to adhere to the SDG 4 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which is about providing a quality education for all children. We are also very passionate about adhering to the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And so we've been running these schools since 2009, and we have 11 schools, and as Natasha mentioned, with about 1,000 children. In our next slide, you can see a sample of one of our schools. Thank you, Natasha. We have four schools on private plantations of the 11, and we have another one on a government plantation. These plantations are remote. They are usually without internet access, but all of them have a clinic for the children for health. They have reasonable roads. They are well serviced by with having a small shop for the workers. and access within the plantation to the various schools on the plantation, because some plantations have 2 or 3 schools, is quite satisfactory. However, the children cannot go out of the plantation for fear of being captured by authorities. The reason for this is because they are undocumented. So it's dangerous for them to be wandering around on any of the main roads, because that's where they're patrolled by the immigration or police. So the tragic situation in Sabah is there are tens of thousands of children who are in the situation of having no access to quality education. And this is one of the reasons why Etanya began its schools. In the next slide, I'd like to point out the issue about citizenship. So in recent years, the last 2 or 3 years, a lot of plantations are making a big effort to get the parents, the families documented. And I noticed this very clearly. In the previous years, women couldn't get a passport. Now they can. So once the parents are documented, then the children can apply for a passport. But despite this amazing development in the last few years, there still are thousands and thousands of children who don't have documentation. And I think this has become a very thorny issue in Malaysia, because they're not recognized as human beings. Whether they live or die, it doesn't matter to anyone. They're like the invisible children of Sabah. So I'm quite proud and happy with the plantations that I work on, because they're really making a big effort to get citizenship for the workers. Not only education, but in the next slide, I'd like to talk very briefly about health and poverty. A lot of our families come from very low socioeconomic groups, and some are caught up in webs of deceit by various mandors that bring them to the plantation. These mandors, I should point out, excuse me, are from their own race of people. They're not from Malaysia. The mandors bring workers into the plantation. And I don't have time to explain about this now, but I'm sure many of you are aware that there is exploitation going on for the workers through this mandor system. By and large, all plantations have a clinic, as I mentioned. Under MSPO, RSPO, they must obey and have this infrastructure for all their workers. So recently too, I've noticed the Malaysian health is giving vaccinations to our children, which is a very commendable effort on their part. For me, because I'm an educator and that's my passion, the next slide, you can see that plantations now almost all have set up schools, or we call them learning centers, Alternative Learning Center or ALC. So some plantations will have several, and some will just have one learning center for the children. It's logical to have a learning center on a plantation, because without this, firstly, the children run wild and get in the way of everybody else. Secondly, I guess they could be open to exploitation, and they're very vulnerable in this situation. But most important for me is I noticed there's an awareness among the plantation owners, and I really commend them for this, that the children need to be educated. They need to be taught good values. They need to have an academic curriculum. They need to have a non-academic curriculum, so that in the future, when they themselves either become workers on this plantation or they move elsewhere, they have qualifications that can set them up for a better standing in life. As far as I know, and I've been working on my plantations for the past 11, nearly 12 years, I have not seen child labor on the plantations I work on. I cannot speak for other plantations. Yes, the children do help their parents after school. According to United Nations, a child is permitted to work under 14 hours a week. Sometimes the children pick up the palm oil kernels that have dropped to the ground, or they do a little bit of weeding and whatnot to help the parents. but they are not employed by the estate. They are just helping out their parents. Whether their parents pay them for this or not, that is an issue I have no idea about. In the next slide, for me, one of the most critical areas that we have to look at when we're dealing with education on plantation schools is the teachers. You see, all children are entitled to a quality education. Just because they are poor and marginalized does not mean that they get a poor or low quality education. I have been told in Sabah by the education department, it's only necessary to teach them the 3 R's. I disagree with this 100%. These children have a right to have equity, just the same as any other child in Malaysia or anywhere else for that matter. So the way to do this is, of course, through our teachers. We are not allowed to employ trained teachers, but that's not an issue because we train our own teachers. In the next slide, you can see an example of one of our teacher training programs where the teachers get together once every 3 months, except in COVID times, of course. And we have a weekend or 3-day training program for them. This is part of the Coalition of Learning Centers Sabah, where we train for free teachers from any learning center in Sabah. So they come and will do workshops and listen to talks given by expert educational trainers. The Coalition of Learning Centers Sabah, I find, has done a huge amount of work for improving the quality of our teachers. So another important thing of this too is they make a WhatsApp group, which means when they go back to their far-flung estates or plantation schools, they can keep in contact with each other if and when they can get internet connection. The next slide is an example of some of the learning that goes on in one of our classrooms on a plantation. I believe that these children should have all the things that a Malaysian teacher teaches their children. Things like problem-based learning, learning outside the classroom, helping each other to learn. As you can see in this photograph, 2 little girls are teaching each other how to read. So these little kids without a school there would have nothing. They wouldn't be able to improve their future. So I want to ensure that they are not missing out on anything. One important thing about education, of course, we have academic, right? But an important thing is we must have skills training. So in the next slide, you can see an example of some of the skills that are taught in our schools. You can see this young man on the left knitted himself this beanie. Quite commendable for a young boy. And then the whole class knitted a blanket, which is completed by now. So if they have these skills, the boy in the picture actually sold them to workers on his plantation and made a little business for himself. We also have agriculture, where the children can, with their parents, learn about farming and how to sustain themselves, especially during COVID times. This project was deliberately set up in August of 2020 to help empower the workers so that they could be sustainable in times of crisis. Some people lost their jobs, and with this farm, they can sustain themselves continuously. In our next slide, there's an example of a school whose parents work on where the parents work on plantation. These children have a lot of psychological pressures, but in school, I want it to be a safe haven for them where they can come together and share experiences with each other. I want them to have fun, to feel relaxed, because the moment they step out of the compound, they could be caught because of their lack of documentation, right? So it's really important that our schools are designed to be a really protective place, one, physically for the children, and two, where the teachers are trained to understand the psychological pressures on the child. These pressures are huge, and it's really sad for them, especially the teenagers. The little ones don't care too much whether they have a passport or not. They don't really understand what it means. But the teenagers do. And when one of their friends is caught and held, then they are continually worried that they could be the next one. So in our teacher training program, as I mentioned, we do a lot of sessions on how to understand the child and his psychological and emotional needs. Now, you see all these situations that I have talked about just now. But in my next slide, I want to mention how grateful I am for the plantations I work on, to the management team. I have never, in all my nearly 12 years of working on plantations and in non-plantation schools too, I've never felt that the workers were abused in any way. Like I said, I can't speak for others. Look at this example here. In 2019 on Workers' Day, the plantation manager organized for all the workers and staff to come to the padan in the center of this plantation. And everybody, or every family, was allowed to let off a lantern into the sky. And this was the most wonderfully emotional and significant evening, because the management and the workers and all the children felt as one. They all were working for that plantation. They knew that the plantation was supporting their every move. So these lanterns soared off over Sabah, wherever, carrying the hopes and the dreams of all our families. I have nothing but commendation for the managers on the plantations I'm on, who really support the children, support us in schools. Anything I need for the school, they will get for me. Any way to help the children, they will do it for me. And in my last slide, this is a picture of the children walking to school through the plantations. But I'd just like to add a comment, because in Malaysia, we do not have a policy for children who are undocumented to go to school or to get health, access to health. Plantation schools, access to health is better than children in cities. In cities, they can be arrested if they go to hospital. But on plantations, of course, the clinic is there and it will help them. So they are fairly safe on their plantation. But what concerns me, and I've been concerned about this for the last almost 12 years, why Malaysia does not yet have a policy that deals with alternative learning centers and children who are undocumented. These children must have education. They must have access to health. There is no discussion about this whatsoever. It must be done. And yet until now, after all these years, every successive government says things. They say that they're going to solve the problem. But until now, nothing has ever been done. I go to the education department and they tell me they love children. I have listened to this for years, but nothing is achieved. And that's why I'm so happy when I heard in the earlier speaker's comment that this discussion should not end now. Action should be taken and it should go on. So with this, I'd like to thank you all very much. And if you want to know more about Etania Schools, just look on our Facebook at Etania Schools Sabah. Take care, all of you. Bye.
Hi, everyone. So I'll just be taking on from Dr. Catherine. So as we wait for everybody for the slides to be put up, let me just introduce myself. I'm Kamini. I used to be a lawyer, as mentioned just now, and I've spent the last 5 years working with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. And during my time there, we had done quite a bit of work when it comes to children and child rights, specifically in the palm oil industry. So I'm very heartened to hear, what has been done, what is being done. It was a wonderful presentation by Dr. Catherine, and it's also very heartening to know that, the industry is taking efforts to move into a space where we are creating safe environments for children, regardless of their legalities and the issues around their documentation. Because I think in our work and in the research that we've done, we've seen more and more with Malaysia, the real gap lies with the undocumented children and how they are being given access, to live a full and meaningful life. So with my presentation, I'm going to get a bit more technical. We're going to look at what the international frameworks are when it comes to children's rights, and then we will look into the aspect of child labor specifically. And finally, we will look at, what is the industry efforts, what's being done by organizations like the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil to ensure that, children are protected and are able to grow in a safe and conducive environment. So if you can move to the next slide, please. Right, so who is a child, right? So the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of a Child, which has been ratified in Malaysia, provides that a child is anyone under the age of 18, unless otherwise noted in international law. So I think that's where you would see, like with what Mr. Lakshmanan mentioned just now, we might have legislations that will actually differ in terms of what the definition of the child is. But for the purposes of international conventions, our starting point or the departure point is children or people who are under the age of 18, they are defined as children. We move to the next slide. Right, so what are the fundamental rights of the child? So before we even go into child labor, we're looking at these 4 cornerstones that tenet what is the basic rights of children all around the world. So we'll start with the right to survival. So of course, in order for a child to survive, they need a safe and clean environment to thrive. They need sufficient access to drinking water. Of course, appropriate shelter, physical safety, and even medical care. So one thing with Dr. Catherine, when you were mentioning just now what is happening in the plantations that you work with, it is good to know that, the aspects of these things are being taken care of the plantations and to create an environment which is conducive. Moving on, we're looking at, the right of a child to grow and develop. Do they have access to education or facilities where they can grow their skills? Do they have access to play? So that's where your sports and cultural activities come into play. The right to participate, are their opinions being heard? Are they being respected, being understood? Do children have a sense of belonging and ownership? And this is especially important because, children are viewed as a party where their voices are not exclusively heard because of their maturity. But this is a fundamental right of a child. When you're looking at situations, you need to see how is this affecting a child? How is this affecting the children in this space? So that is why this has been entrenched into the international principles. And finally, of course, the right to protection. Are they being taken care of? Are they free from harassment? Is the space that they are growing up in free from discrimination and exploitation? And finally, again, are they in a safe environment where they can grow? Next slide. So when we look at international frameworks, of course, the point of departure, like I mentioned just now, we start with the United Nations Conventions on the Right of Children. But then when we look at the aspect of work itself, we're looking at the minimum age conventions from the ILO, and of course, the worst form of child labor, the worst forms of child labor from the ILO. But over and above that, I think it's also important for us to look at international legislations that impact the supply chain. Because whilst we are looking at countries, we are a country that is importing palm oil, these legislations have an impact on the supply chain. So more and more, we are looking at international laws such as the UK Modern Slavery Act and the California Transparency and Supply Chain Acts, where the supply chain, so for instance, the buyer, if they're based in the UK, they will then be subjected to this law, and they have to ensure that their entire supply chain is free of modern slavery. And child labor goes into that component of forced labor and modern slavery. So in that sense, if they were to source from a base in Malaysia, and if there is allegations of child labor on that particular supply base, then they will not be able to source from this country. So in that sense, it's very important for us to also take note of these legislations that are coming out. And I think another important point that we are looking at in terms of development of international framework is the mandatory supply and value chain due diligence frameworks that are coming up. So more and more we see in legislations or jurisdictions like in the EU, even in Australia, where you're looking at a requirement, a mandatory requirement for due diligence to be conducted on the supply chain of the particular importing or exporting country companies. And therefore, these are frameworks that you need to take into consideration as well when you start looking into developing your, if you're a company, you're starting to look into your policy development, how you're managing your supply chain, how you're managing your labor force, including your policies on child labor, to ensure that you're meeting the criteria that is contained within these international frameworks as well. Next. So child labor. So let's get into the meat of this. What is child labor? Child labor is defined as work that deprives children of their childhood, their potential, and their dignity, and that is harmful to physical and mental development. So who does this apply to? This applies to all children under the age of 18 involved in the worst forms of child labor, children under the age of 12 taking part in economic activity, and finally, all 12 to 14-year-olds which are engaged in more than light work. All right, so I'm going to break this down a bit, right? So what does this mean? Does this mean that if you're under the age of 18, you cannot work? No, that it doesn't work in that sense. What it means is it breaks it down to a few components. First, if you're under the age of 18, you cannot be involved in worse forms of child labor. So what are worse forms of child labor? That's work that is dangerous or hazardous. It's impacting the life of the child. Those are dangerous work, is basically work that children or people under the age of 18 cannot participate in. If you're under the age of 12, you should not be participating in economic activities at all. And finally, if you're looking at 12 to 14-year-olds, you must be only engaged in light work. So children can only be participating in light work. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the ILO defines light work as not likely to be harmful to a child's health or development, and not likely to be detrimental to their attendance at school or vocational training. So I think if I can give an example, right, of what light work means. A simple one would be, if you are a child or you have a child that's helping their parent out in the hawker centers after school, serving food and stuff like that. If they are at the age of 12 and above, they can be engaged in stuff like that. Because it's light, it doesn't deprive them from schools. I think in the palm oil context, one thing that we would look at, or one thing that could be possibly considered, is if they are following their parents to pick up loose fruits. But then again, that is also subject to when it becomes hazardous and when it becomes something that is becoming harmful to their health. Are they following their parents, but as a result of that, they're missing out on school? That's when you start looking at forms or elements of child labor kicking in already. But the act itself might not necessarily be that the child is subjected to child labor. The next thing is we're looking at young workers. So young workers refer to children who are of legal age, but below 18. So these are children between the ages to 15 to 17. So these people, they can be at work, but they must not engage in hazardous work. And it has to be performed under adult supervision. All right, next slide. Okay, so I think that sort of sets down what is the the framework of a child being in a space, a workspace. So now let's look into what the RSPO is all about. So basically, the RSPO is a multi-stakeholder initiative that aspires to transform markets to make sustainable palm oil the norm. So now what does this mean, right? So the RSPO is made out of, it's a member-based organization, and it's made out of the 7 key stakeholders across the palm oil industry. And this is a global organization. So you will have the producers, the growers who produce palm oil, you will have the processors and traders, you'll have the financial institutions, you'll have the social NGOs, the environment and NGOs, the retailers, and keep forgetting the last one. But basically you have 7 of these stakeholders, and they come together and they define what is the production of palm oil, what should be sustainable production of palm oil. And this is done through a set of principles and criteria and standards that governs what sustainable palm oil is. So with the RSPO right now, what we have is the RSPO Principles and Criteria 2018, which looks into standards that are applied to the production of palm oil. And this is, again, like I mentioned, global. And we look at both environmental standards as well as human rights standards. So I'm just going to go from that picture and I'm going to bring it down to a smaller space to focus on human rights specifically. And when it comes to human rights, again, the focus then goes down to the community that works around the palm oil concessions or where palm oil is grown. So how is this production of palm oil impacting the people there? You know, are they aware of the impacts? Are they benefiting from the development of the concession? So what happens with the RSPO is we have these standards that will help the producer ensure that they're growing their crop cohesively together and bringing up the community around them as well. So similar to community development, we also have a set of standards for workers who work on the palm oil plantations. And within that, we have a component where it's specific for child labor. So of course, with RSPO, there is a blanket no child labor on plantations. If a child is found to be working on a plantation, and if it's found in an audit, the company will then be given a penalty, which they will then need to clear before they can be issued with a certificate of sustainable production. Besides the PNC 2018, we also have a standard for independent smallholders. Now, with the independent smallholder standard, it is a transformative set of standards where we look at moving smallholders from where they are to in a stepwise approach to ensure that they are able to then grow sustainably, grow palm oil sustainably. And within those components, I think you can move to the next slide. I've gotten way ahead of myself. Right, so within these components, we are looking at, we'll have a set of principles and criteria and indicators on how we can ensure that children are being protected. So with the PNC 2018, which applies to the big companies, they have a clear criteria that says that children should not be employed in the palm oil plantation, and there should be no forms of child labor. And what can happen is the indicator then provides a breakdown to the companies to make sure that their systems are conducive enough so that you don't see children on plantation. So how do you look at employment contracts? How do you make sure that there are photographic evidence to ensure that children are not there? You know, so you're creating an environment and a space that we are not going to be a systemic space that will not employ or will not let children fall through the cracks and end up in a situation of forced labor or child labor rather. With the independent smallholder standard, on the other hand, we've taken a different approach. And that's because more often than not, when you're looking at small holdings, these are normally family farms. And with family farms, we're also looking at, you know, we need to balance the need for livelihood together with international human rights standards. So when we look at if you're able to look at the RSPO independent smallholder standards, you will see that the main component when it comes to child labor is that children are not employed or exploited. if you're working in a family farm, children can be present on the family farm, but they need to work under adult supervision, and it doesn't interfere with their education programs. And of course, children are not exposed to hazardous working conditions. Can you move to the next slide? So this again with the RSPO, that was the point of departure that the RSPO started from. That yes, you need to make sure that there are no children on the plantation working. But we've also realized that when you look at the protection of the child, we don't want to only focus on the end result, which is a child working on the plantation. We need to see how are we creating a conducive environment to make sure that children are able to grow up in a way that, that allows them to thrive, not just survive, but thrive. And because of that, and together with the UNICEF, RSPO sat down and embarked on a project around child rights. So this came from a study that was conducted in Indonesia, where it was a focus to look at what are the impacts of the palm oil industry on children. And seven impact areas were identified from this, and they were child protection, child labor, education, maternity protection and breastfeeding, childcare, health and nutrition, and finally water, sanitization and hygiene. All right, so we realized that you need to cover these impact areas in order to ensure that they are thriving and growing, like how Dr. Catherine mentioned earlier. And we broke that down a little bit more, worked together with the members of the RSPO to identify what are the efforts that are already being taken, that are already being done. We also looked at our principles and criteria to see how is it we are creating this conducive environment. So you'll see that although in the PNC, you only have that one component on no child labor, but peppered through it in the PNC, the principles and criteria, you will see indicators and criteria like, you need to have breastfeeding breaks, which are adequately provided and decided together with the mother. You need to make sure that housing facilities have schools nearby. So it all comes down to ensuring that you're creating this space where people can thrive. Another big one was companies or RSPO members now need to pay their workers a minimum wage. And we've realized that one big reason why people end up, or why children end up in spaces of forced labor, is because the family is not earning enough, a decent income, and therefore they have to supplement the income that comes in. So taking this very holistic approach, we've realized that, okay, we need to look at a space where we're growing and we're being aspirative more than anything else. And with that, we've developed a set of guidances for all the palm oil stakeholders, or the stakeholders that we believe are very important to ensure that, they are creating a space. So how they say it takes a village to bring up a child. So when you're looking at these 4 guidances or these 4 spaces, you're looking at, okay, what is the role of the palm oil producer? When it comes to the supply chain, what are you doing to ensure that your supply chain is free from child labor? Smallholders, what does this mean? What does this light work mean? What does dangerous and hazardous work mean? If my child can't have access to school, what do I send? What do I do? Where do I send my children to? And of course, finally, with the auditors and certification bodies, they then need to come into the auditing space with a framework at the back of their heads that is very protective towards children. So using these points of departure, we've come up with these guidances, and these guidances, as I mentioned, is very aspirational. It helps producers, or wherever you are in the entire palm oil supply chain, to sort of assess what is your, where you are right now. And it's a very intuitive set of guidances where you can, okay, if I'm in this level, this is how I can make my operations better or more conducive. Because at the end of the day, I think this has been repeated time and time again. Children are our greatest assets. So what are we doing to invest in them? And this is not just a one party or one actor sort of initiative. Everybody needs to come together. And I think this is where the industry can play its role, whether you're looking at one child or you're looking at the entire nation of children. So I think I will stop there and hand the mic back. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Catherine, for helping us understand the lived experiences of children living on palm oil plantations and for sharing the work that you're doing with the Tanya schools in Sabah. Thank you as well to Kamini for providing us with an overview of the international standards and framework for children in this context, and also for sharing how RSPO is working to make sustainable palm oil the norm. We're going to head into a Q&A session now. We're running a little bit early, which is great. There's a little bit more time for Q&A. So I'm going to invite Dr. Catherine and Kamini to turn their video on, and we'll kick off. We've got quite a number of questions, so we're going to get started with those. In the meantime, anybody else, if you've got questions, please drop them in the Q&A box and do indicate which speaker your question is directed at if possible. So the first question that I'm going to start with, first two questions actually are for Dr. Catherine, and I'm going to bundle those. Can you tell us, in your experience, what the percentage is of children who live on these plantations that are documented versus undocumented? And in your experience, do you see that they have different experiences on the same plantation?
Thank you so much to those who asked this question. When I started this project in 2009, almost all children were undocumented. Nobody had any birth certificate, passport, visa, even the parents. The issue here is that many of these children, their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, they're all born in Sabah. So we have three categories of children. One is the Filipino children, one is the Indonesian, and one are Malaysians. These are the three main groups. Okay, Malaysians, I still cannot fathom why they are in our schools, because one parent is holding a blue IC. The other parent may not have documentation. And although some people say they can go to government school, that is not true. They can't. I've tried to get them into government school. I have got one child I managed to get in. Indonesian children, you can generally trace back to Indonesia through the generations, but all their family are living here. So they have nobody back in Indonesia. So if you ask them, or you send them back rather, repatriate them, they've got no one to go to. But worst of all are the Filipino children. Without documentation, they're born here, right? Children who are born here. Their families are here. They can't go anywhere because the Philippines doesn't take them back nowadays. Malaysia doesn't want them and tries to send them back. Well, where do you go? You know, and sometimes the authorities say, oh, we're going to send them back to their home country. What is their home country? You need to think about this. They've been here for 3 or 4 generations. Sabah is their home country. They don't know a single thing about whatever is supposed to be their home. So I can understand how complicated this is for the authorities to sort out. And that's why until now, nobody can sort it out. But the person who asked this question said about documentation now. Yes, as I mentioned, in the last few years, the oil palm plantations that I'm working on have made a huge effort to get documentation for these children. I'll give you an example. My teachers are also, some of them are Indonesian. They didn't have documentation. They couldn't come to our teacher training program when I first started it in 2015. But last year, 2019, 2020 was a little bit out because of COVID, but they could come because they got a passport by then. So you can see that maybe it's MSPO, RSPO, I don't know what it is, but there are some very positive signs of the families now getting documentation. And I'm talking here about Indonesian families, yeah? Filipino families, because they don't have a consulate in Sabah, find it very difficult to get documentation. Yeah, have I covered the 2 questions?
Yeah, I think that sufficiently covers both questions. I just want to say, I think it's incredible that, you know, the work that you've done, particularly in the last, you know, few years, has made such a big impact. And as much as we have miles to go before we can sleep, you know, proverbially speaking, it's just so nice to hear about the positives and the progress that we are making. So thank you for sharing that as well, Dr. Catherine.
Thank you.
No worries at all. My next 4 questions actually, I think, if not more, maybe for Kamini. So I might pop over to those quickly before we come back to joint questions. So we've got a couple of questions on the international frameworks and how they're enforced. So Kamini, could you tell us a little bit more about the enforcement of these international frameworks in Malaysia? Are they enforced? To what extent? Yeah, could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So looking at the international frameworks, first you need to look at what frameworks they are, right? So if you look at the slide that I presented just now, you will see on the left side, you'll see the ILO conventions, you will see the UN conventions. So that depends on whether the country has ratified those conventions or not. So that's the basic overview of things. And how do they ratify it? Is first they say, okay, yes, we will comply to this, and we will then include it into our national legislative frameworks to ensure that this is then being meted out in the country. So with Malaysia, I believe we have ratified the CRC, the Conventions on the Right of the Child, as well as the worst forms of modern slavery and the Minimum Age Act. So you will see that's why we have like the CYPA, the Children's and Young Persons Act, which says that, okay, a child is defined as by, as Mr. Lakshmanan pointed out just now, 17 and above. But then the CYPA then goes down to say, okay, what kind of work the children can do? You know, what or rather people within that age group of 15 to 17 or 18 can do. So that's how you see the ratification has been done. And then when you look at the Child Act, on the other hand, they are defining children as 18 and above. So sometimes that's how you see whether these things has been ratified in a particular country. I think with Malaysia, we have ratified the main conventions around the rights of the child. In terms of the other legislations that I pointed out just now, those are legislations within those jurisdictions. So if you're looking at the human rights due diligence framework legislations that are being discussed in the EU right now, those are for the companies or the producers that are sourcing, you know, from developing countries such as ours. So why it's important for us is that if we don't meet those standards, we are not going to be able to export to these countries, and therefore you lose access to those markets. So that's why it's also important for us to be aware and be able to take or ensure that our supply chains are also clear and meeting those standard requirements, basically.
Great, thank you so much for that. We've got a question on the definition of light work. So the question is, the definition of light work is broad in this context for young workers. Does RSPO have a list of work that is considered light work for young workers in the all palm plantation producer sort of sector?
Okay, so to date, we don't have one that is specific, but what we do is we do have a guidance. Because you see, with the RSPO, we are looking at companies that are you know, the size of it cuts across. You'll have like really small producers, but at the same time, you have concessions that goes on for miles and miles. So then depending on what the needs and the assessments are of that particular production, you then identify. But of course, there are the minimum of what lightweight, what is dangerous and hazardous. And that is then defined within the jurisdictions of the countries themselves. So it's a bit complicated. So, just sit with me. What we have is we have this great RSPO principles and criteria. All right. So this is applicable across the world globally. Yeah. But you need to fit that to scale. So in the instance in Malaysia, what happens is they will take this PNC, or what has happened already, they'll take this RSPO principles and criteria, and then they will interpret it to the Malaysian conditions. Right. All right. And within that conditions, they will then be able to break down to see, okay, these are things which normally happens in this country, right? So, children shouldn't be found here. Children shouldn't be found there. So in Malaysia, I can speak for the RSPO, it is very clear when it comes to the principles and criteria, children should not be engaged at all or employed. That just follows our laws as well. But if we're going to look at it from a different point of view, if we're looking at it from a West African country, for instance, where access to school is not possible, and it's more important for the child to be actually earning, bringing in money to the family, then the way it's interpreted will differ depending on the what you call that, the conditions of that country and the needs of that particular space.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. Could you elaborate a little bit more about how audits and certification bodies within RSPO might address child rights issues at a larger level, if at all, beyond correction and possibly some sanction for the company? Is there further scope for more systemic changes? So this is a question from Preeta.
Yeah, okay, that's actually a really good question. So with the RSPO, again, you have to look at RSPO, the principles and criteria, as a tool, right? And the intention is that we are pushing the industry to move towards sustainable production. And like I mentioned, the point of departure is that we're ensuring that the companies are free from forced labor and child labor. And that is there in the principles and criteria itself, no forced labor. So what happens is, with the audit system, or the assurance system that the RSPO has, is that they are audited every year to ensure that their certificates are renewed on a yearly basis. And a certificate lasts for 5 years. So if a child labor situation is detected, what the auditor needs to do is, the auditor needs to identify, how did this happen? What is the weakness in the system? What does the company have in place to remediate this system? So in that sense, we are moving the companies to then, one, take responsibility for your issues, and also to create a system where you are also, ensuring that your space is safe and free from any human rights violations. So in that sense, it is more of an encouragement that we have. Of course, there are sanctions in place. If this issue has not been remediated, if it's detected and not remediated within the specific time, there are sanctions in place, and this can even include termination or suspension of the certificate, and that has economic bearings on the member.
Okay, great. I think we're going to ask one more question, as we're very close to the break now. In fact, sort of eating into break time, but because I'm running this and I really want to ask this question, I'm going to ask it. This question comes from Shamila. It's quite a lengthy one, so bear with me. So what she said is, she believes that the issue of child labor, access to healthcare, education, and quality living are also tied to parents' financial affordability to provide these to their children, or the possibility to be less dependent on their children's involvement to generate sufficient income. So her question is, and I think Dr. Catherine, if you have any feedback on this as well alongside Kamini, that would be great. What social benefits these parents working in the palm oil plantation are entitled to? So what social benefits are they entitled to? And in general, is there a comparison between palm oil laborers in East versus West Malaysia? And she's got a follow-up to that, which is, what aspect of social benefits should be improved for these parents and laborers to pave the way for a brighter future for these children born into this industry and break the social cycle of reliance on the young? You're on mute, Kamini.
Okay, sorry. I just said, oh, that's a very highly packed question, so I'll try. I'll try and
so I think just a couple of things specifically, right? So social benefits that parents should be entitled to sort of break this cycle, of social reliance in the young, to pave the way for a brighter future. I think that's the primary gist of the question. And then as a follow-up to that, any general comparisons between East and West Malaysia in that space?
I think, okay, so it starts this way, right? When you're looking at the benefits, the workers should be entitled at minimum to the similar benefits that are provided in the Employment Act of 1955. All right, so that doesn't differ from whether you're a local worker or if you're a migrant worker. It should be the same, right? So that's the first point of departure. But of course, we are realizing now more and more that the benefits that are in the Employment Act are the bare minimum. Because things as simple as minimum wage, for instance, is that really sufficient to have a family living in a decent way? That's one component that we need to think about. So because of that, I think that's why we are seeing more and more standards like this come about, standards like the RSPO, standards like the MSPO come about, because you are now looking at, okay, the bare minimum is not just cutting it anymore. What are we doing to look beyond? So talking about it from the RSPO point of view, right, and as well as international frameworks that we are seeing being developed right now and initiatives, we are looking at things that when you look at the workers' rights, you need to look at a holistic right, for the person. Is their income sufficient? Do they have access to remedy? Are they in a safe and secure condition, or are they vulnerable? As we know, I think most of us here are familiar with the issues around migrant workers in Malaysia, and even we've seen it in other commodities as well, in terms of the rubber glove industry, and for instance. So we need to scale up, I think, and that's where standards like the RSPO can help. But again, that's not the only thing. That's not the only point of departure. You will also have, you look at some companies, they have very good initiatives when it comes to workers. So like, for instance, they will actually look at, how are they creating a safe space, how they're creating, what some companies provide childcare, for instance, so companies have taken the initiative to build a conducive ecosystem for people to thrive in as well. So I think recommendations need to be given to the companies towards that. In terms of what happens between East Malaysia and West Malaysia, and I'm sure we'll be tackling that in the next session, but I think what is the main thing is the demographic of workers between East and West. So whereas in Sabah, like you see, the workers normally come from Philippines and Indonesia, and more often than not, the focus is on undocumented workers, because that's where they are the most vulnerable ones. And how undocumented workers, how they come about as well, it's just through a small thing, and suddenly you don't have your legalization. Our borders are so porous. So it's as good as just taking a motorbike from Kalimantan and driving into Sabah, and you lo and behold, you're working here, And because in Sabah, they come and they work with their families, they bring their families along. And that's where, the issue of undocumented children comes about. In Malaysia, in Peninsula, on the other hand, you are looking at migrants that are coming from, you're looking at migrants that are migrating from Nepal, from India, or even if they do come from Indonesia, they're predominantly coming as single workers, just male workers, and they're not coming with their families when we're looking at migrant workers, of course. So in that sense, the issue of child labor is not so prevalent in Peninsula, unless you're looking at local workers and their children not having access to school and these basic amenities, which does happen as well. So, and then of course, you're looking at the smallholder aspect and children working on plantations. So in that sense, that's how it differs. I think the issue of undocumented workers, which I think Dr. Catherine can speak more towards too, is the main space where, these things are happening, basically.
Right. Thank you for that, Kamini. Dr. Catherine, did you have anything to add to that?
I think that Kamini has pretty well summed it up from the legal. I just like to add on one thing, that the plantations, I actually live with these people on the plantation, so I know very well about their work space and their livelihood. I think the plantations provide them with a very good lifestyle. They have very nice house, water, all of this is free. They can do overtime if they want to improve their income. There's plenty of opportunity for them to do overtime. The thing that concerns me with that is they don't have enough time with their children, which then it falls back on the school, because in the morning, the parents have gone off to work really early and the children have to get themselves breakfast and to school. So I think that the ecosystem that's provided by the managers, the Malaysian managers of plantations, is pretty good when it comes to the areas that I work on anyway. Yeah, thank you. I know your time is up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Catherine and Kamini, for your valuable insights. And thank you to the audience for that really engaging Q&A session. There are a couple of questions that we haven't been able to get to. We're very sorry about that. But Kamini and Dr. Catherine, if you are able to stay on and answer those via the Q&A box through chat, that would be great. Before we take a quick break, we do have a few poll questions that should be appearing on your screen right about now. We invite the audience, please go ahead to enter your answers, and we will see you back here for the second session a little bit later than expected at 2:20 p.m. Thank you so much, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to session 2 of today's webinar. For those of you who have just joined us, my name is Shini and I'm from LexisNexis Southeast Asia. And this is a webinar that we are hosting in collaboration with Earthworm Foundation on child rights in the palm oil industry. So just to kick off this second session, in the next 45 minutes, we will be covering legal considerations relating to children on palm oil plantations, with a specific focus on risks and liabilities. To take you through this topic, we have 3 esteemed speakers addressing you today. And in the interest of not interrupting what I'm sure will be a very engaging session, I'm going to kick this off by introducing all of our speakers now. So first we have Anira Chowdhury, who you can now see on your screen. Hi, Anira. Anira is from AJ Chowdhury, and she brings with her extensive experience in employment and labor laws in both litigious and non-litigious matters. So Anira will be setting the stage for us today. She'll be providing an overview of child protection for employment rights, beginning with the UN conventions, and then moving on to the laws governing East and West Malaysia. Our second speaker for this session is Sarah Lau from Screen. Sarah also has extensive experience in the employment space. She's very experienced in immigration employment work, including employment of expatriates and foreign workers in Malaysia. So Sarah will be covering terms and conditions of employment, specifically relating to women, children, and migrant workers in West Malaysia. Finally, we have Nicholas Wong of Reddy & Co., who will be our final speaker for this session. Nicholas is an advocate of the High Court of Sabah and Sarawak and will be taking us through the legal provisions relating to the children and women in per the labor ordinances of Sabah and Sarawak specifically. Now, before I hand over to the speakers, I'd just like to remind you to share any questions that you may have using the Q&A feature, which you should be able to access from the bottom of your screen. Please do indicate who your question is for, if it's for a specific speaker or if it's for the panel at large. We will endeavor to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the session, but in the interest of keeping time, we do apologize in advance if we're unable to address all of the questions. Thank you, everyone, and over to you, Anira.
Thanks so much, Sheeny, for such a nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. And let me just say thank you as well to Kamini and Dr. Catherine and the rest of the speakers, because it was really invaluable to hear the insight from people on the ground and who work with migrants and families and children, whether documented and undocumented. It was really enlightening for me, who only thinks about these things from a legal perspective most of the time. And it was really great as well to hear from the ministry as well and their take on the issues. Just a short introduction. I am Anira Chowdhury. I run a small legal practice in Bangsa South in KL. And part of my portfolio is advising on child protection and labor law issues. And today, I won't take up too much of your time. Today, my main role is to provide a brief overview of how to think about child protection issues in terms of legality and risk to those involved in the oil palm industry. So I'm just supposed to give a very brief overview on legal considerations and what corporate, how to look at it from a corporate perspective. Now, the best way to think about this is to start by considering the inherent rights that no one can take away from a child and then work from there. I won't go into what these specific rights are because Kamini has done an amazing job at it. It's safe to say that these rights are broad and they are across the board. The children have a right to be basically protected, nurtured, and be free from all forms of violence, abuse, neglect, maltreatment, or exploitation of any kind. Once we understand what these rights are, it becomes easier to extrapolate what corresponding responsibilities of others are in relation to those rights. Those responsibilities are basically to protect the health, safety, and also morals of children. And the practical aspect of this is that there are then clear duties and obligations to not interfere, and at times to actively protect these bundle of rights that children have. And anything that fails to protect or that interferes with this bundle of rights then becomes risk, whether legal or corporate or commercial. For example, today is a really good example. Top Glove, I think, is not having a good day today because one of their shipments has just been blocked due to allegations of forced labor. Therefore, it is easy to see that these issues to do with migrants, how one treats one's labor and one's workforce has extremely wide and sometimes criminal consequences. Yeah. Now, when we talk about legal risks, we also talk about direct and indirect legal risks. For example, whilst a plantation owner may not directly employ a child, there may be employees on the plantation who bring their children to work, whether it's just to watch over them or to care for them, or whether they are living on the plantation, or even sometimes to assist them in their work. Now, for wages, for situations where wages of the oil palm workers are dependent on the fruits harvested or based on the yields that they provide, it is not uncommon to find children in the plantations helping out in the activities that would then add to the yields, right? So whilst not directly employing children, such a scenario will still engage different rights and obligations for employers and those in the industry. Therefore, the industry has to self-regulate itself, not least because it is becoming a hot issue nowadays. And it is also because, as Kamini put it, all the legislation does is to provide bare minimum standards that you should implement, but it doesn't mean that those should be the standards to be implemented. The better the standards are, the better your labor workforce is treated, the better your yields for the owners of the plantations. And also when it comes to protecting or thinking about child protection, it becomes also a moral and social responsibility. And while you may think that moral and social responsibilities have nothing to do with legal responsibilities, they indirectly do, in the sense that most of our laws that are drafted take into account moral and social considerations. And such laws will always be more protective of the rights of a child as against the rights of others. Yeah. There has been international consensus on what the rights of children are and what they need and what needs protecting. There is the CRC that was ratified in 1995. A direct consequence of the CRC was the fact that we now have a Child Act. And we have also legislation on the sexual exploitation of children. Now, Malaysia, being a signatory of an international convention, does not automatically make the provisions of that convention law. In Malaysia, we have a two-tiered system where we need local laws enacted that would codify the international obligations before it becomes binding. And when we did ratify the CRC, we had reservations to it. I think there were about 4 or 5 reservations. Reservations meaning we disagreed to certain of its provisions. And one of them was the fact that we disagreed to Article 37 on torture and deprivation of liberty, and we disagreed to Article 7 on name and nationality. And that really means that out of all the unprotected children in Malaysia, the ones who are not documented are right at the bottom of the ladder, right? There are also the International Labour Organization Conventions on child and forced labor and minimum ages. And on top of that, we can find guidance from the UN on their guiding principles on business and human rights and their child safeguarding toolkit for business. There are plenty of reports, the ministry's report, Wilmar report. There are plenty of write-ups on what international standards are on child rights. There is a lot of material out there that can help inform us as to what the rights are and how they are to be protected. And these should be used as a starting point as well. And Malaysia is committed to its Sustainable Development Goal, which basically target 8.7 says, we are meant to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor, end modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, and by 2025, end child labor in all its forms. Therefore, the laws that deal with child protection are only going to get stronger, not weaker, as we move along. It is the practical implementation of these standards that is the more complicated, bearing in mind how huge plantations are, how huge some corporations are as well, and also bearing in mind how many laws are triggered by the employment of workers, both migrant, foreign workers, and local workers. And to make matters a little bit more complicated, there is a somewhat differing legal framework between East and West Malaysia, which the next two speakers will be talking more about. So the main concern is to ensure that you as a plantation owner, or you as being part of the industry, is to make sure that you are complying with all your legal obligations and implementing the best possible practice that you can within your industry. The way that I approach this problem is by asking questions to my clients, which is, Are you aware and have you codified in some way the applicable laws or the laws that apply to you within your locality? Because you have to know what the laws are for you to be able to work within them and for you to draft your own internal policies and best practices that will be applied in the company. So in Malaysia, we have various labor ordinances. We have the Employment Act, which is for West Malaysia. We have the Sarawak Labor Ordinance for Sarawak and the Labor Ordinance also for Sabah. For West Malaysia, we also have the Children and Young Persons Employment Act 1966. And I think Mr. Nicholas Wong will also be talking about the corresponding East Malaysian legislation. It is written in this act that the employment of a child or young person should not be dangerous to life, limb, health, safety, or morals. Yeah. And within this act, there are 2 minimum age requirements, which we've already talked about. That minimum age requirement is different when we define a child vis-a-vis the Child Act, and it's also different when we define a young person vis-a-vis the Factory and Machineries Act. Other types of laws that you will need to know about would be the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act, the Factories and Machineries Act, like I've said, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, 1994, where in this act you can find general duties of health and safety that apply to employees, that apply not just to employees, but also to the employer's duties as occupier of the premises or the land. And then we have various legislation and regulations on minimum standard of housing as well, where children come under the definition of dependents. And aside from statutory duties, which would apply, we also have what your contractual obligations will be vis-a-vis your employees, your suppliers, your third parties, your independent contractors, your service agencies, and the other people that you generally tend to do business with. And you also have on top of that, even though you may not have a contract with this person or this company, you may have duties of care nonetheless that go beyond what contract is. Now, knowing about the concept of duty of care is important because it applies whether or not there's a written agreement or not. It applies due to the special relationship that you may have with the person. For example, an employer has a duty of care to ensure the health and safety of the employee. An employer who is also an occupier of premises or land has duties of care vis-a-vis their occupier's liability and obligations. On top of duty of care, which is not written really in any law, we also have the concept of vicarious liability, in which the employer can be made responsible for unlawful actions of a third party. Oftentimes, the wrongful acts done by employees can also reach the employers in the sense that the employers may be found vicariously liable as well. So that is the second question to ask on top of applicable legislation. What other duties would you have that is not written anywhere but apply to you nonetheless? The third question would be, once you know all of these things, do you have SOPs in place that specifically cover how you carry out these duties and how you apply the legislation? A very good example would be to look into your hiring practices and to see whether your SOPs or the way you run your company has comprehensive interviews, whether you do your age checks, how do you verify your age? Do you just take their word for it? Do you ask for documentation? Do you run background checks on your employees? There is now a sexual offenders registry. Do you run background checks on that, which you should do, particularly if you do have children on your premises? Do you conduct assessments as to what type of work is required? How do you define it? Is it light? Is it heavy? Is it hazardous? Do you know who at all times is doing the work? Are you able to say 100% that your supply chain is completely free of child or forced labor? If you're not able to say that, do you conduct regular assessments to check that? Do you require, when you hire people, for them to disclose whether they have a criminal background or or anything that may prohibit them from working with you, especially if you have children in the plantation. You should then also check your SOPs to say that there should be SOPs in place that cater for who the person in charge is within the company, under whose responsibility it comes. Do you have a committee, especially for child protection? Who has mandate to deal with the problems? Is there a complaints mechanism? And does HR know how to deal with, and have they been trained in dealing with problems to do with child protection? Now, strictly speaking, SOPs like these are not strictly necessary, and this is actually the point that I want to end with today, is to say that whilst not legally necessary to have, these in detail, in-depth SOPs, if you look at it overall from the perspective of risk, having such clear and specific policies in place will ultimately result in risk, legal and corporate risk, being reduced anyway, and reduce the risk of something going horribly wrong down the road. The last thing I want to say is that there also are duties that apply to you in terms of reporting if you are aware of a case of a sexual exploitation of a child or a crime being committed. Vis-a-vis the Sexual Offences Against Children Act and the Penal Code, there are also duties to report. I'm not going to have much time to go into anything else, but in terms of the West Malaysian law, Ms. Sarah Lau will be able to provide excellent insight into maternity and child protections, and Mr. Nicholas Wong will provide his expertise on East Malaysian laws. Thank you so much for your time, and I will now pass the space on to Sarah. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Let me just get this in order. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah. I am an employment and labor lawyer working in West Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur, one of the largest law firms. And I'm very privileged. I feel very privileged to be able to share with you today. And I feel even luckier to have logged in a little bit earlier and to have heard from Kamini and from Catherine, and also from what Anira has just given a broad overview of. Now, I see, I see the topics that I will speak today as an extension of the issues that Kamini has brought up in the earlier session. So I think that's a good combination. Kamini was talking about how we had ratified certain international conventions, and we needed to see whether that had trickled down into our legislation to be able to provide the adequate protection to children and to laborers as a whole. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at our labor legislation and our children's labor legislation and see whether we measure up to international standards. Just a qualification before I begin. The laws in West Malaysia and East Malaysia are not always the same. Now, particularly where the employment of children and where employment in general is concerned, there are different laws which apply to West Malaysia and to East Malaysia. So Nicholas, my fellow panelist, will be speaking about East Malaysia, whereas I'll take you through West Malaysia. Now, I am aware that the concerns that we are speaking today largely impact issues in East Malaysia, so I will be mindful to give priority to my fellow panelist Nicholas, so that he'll be able to address these issues in more detail. Okay, so without further ado, let's begin. Okay, the first thing to note is that there are a couple of legislations in Malaysia which pertain to minimum terms and conditions of employment. Actually, there are many type of legislations in Malaysia. One of them is even the minimum wage order. However, many of these legislations are geography specific. So like I was talking about the minimum wage order, even the minimum wages in Peninsular Malaysia is different than East Malaysia. Even within Peninsular Malaysia, it's different depending on the locality and district that you live in. So some labor legislations may be enforced in Peninsular Malaysia, but the same will not be enforced in Sabah and Sarawak. Now, one such legislation is the Employment Act 1955, which is applicable to workers in Peninsular Malaysia only. It is our fundamental legislation that protects only a certain category of workers. And these category of workers are those what we call who engage in lower level labor. They earn 2,000 ringgit or less, or regardless of how much they earn, they are involved in manual labor. Now, working in a palm oil industry, which is part of an agricultural undertaking, would fall within the group of workers which are protected by the Employment Act 1955. Now that we have established that a certain group of workers or employees fall within the Employment Act 1955, it is important to take note of the minimum terms and conditions which is governed by the Employment Act 1955. These minimum requirements in relation to terms and conditions of employment include in relation to work hours, rest days, work on a rest day, shift work, overtime payments, protection from deduction of wages, public holidays, annual leave, sick leave and hospitalization leave, payment of termination benefits, time for payment of wages, notice of termination of contract, and of course there is also a category which applies to the employment of female employees. The one thing that's important to remember is that any term or condition in an employment contract entered into with these category of employees, including those who work on the palm oil plantation, which is less favorable than is what is prescribed under the Employment Act 1955, will be void. So essentially what this means is that these provisions on work hours, rest days, all those which I've stated earlier, they must be in compliance with the law, and they must be in compliance with the minimum requirements of law. As Kamini had stated earlier, the Employment Act provides the minimum standard, and we have to be a self-regulating industry. Although this is a minimum standard, that's not the required standard to adhere to. What I mean to say is that we can generate our own policies and our own terms of conditions of employment, which are more favorable than these minimum terms and conditions under law. And this will actually help alleviate the social problem and the social cycle that involves the employment of children. Non-compliance to the minimum standards, however, will invite fines and penalties. Depending on what the offense is, you are looking at least a penalty of 10,000 ringgit. And on top of that, you will also be required to reimburse the employee for what you had deprived them of. So for example, if you had not paid them for overtime payments, you must reimburse. Now, another thing that's important to remember is that there is no discrimination of foreign workers where the Employment Act is concerned. So what this means is that minimum terms and conditions of employment is as applicable to non-Malaysian workers as it is to Malaysian workers. This is also the case where there's a collective agreement in force. If there's a collective agreement in force, it must also apply to those foreign workers who fall within the scope of the collective agreement. So in that sense, I think it's important to remember that no distinction should be made between the type of workers that are engaged in the palm oil industry. They should be treated fairly. They should be treated equally. They should not be discriminated simply because they are not Malaysian. So for corporations, I think the first basic thing to do is look through your employment contracts, your collective agreements, your employment handbooks and policies. Do a general and brief assessment on whether these provisions, which I've spoke about earlier, are in accordance with the statute, or are you offering something better? Can you afford to offer something better? Okay, so now I want to briefly move on to the employment of women. Women enjoy some additional minimum terms and conditions of employment under the Employment Act. For example, they are entitled to a maternity benefit. Generally, a female employee is entitled to 60 days of maternity benefit with some preconditions, for example, in relation to the number of children, how long they've been employed. But generally, they have 60 days. So ensure that your female employees on site are enjoying that 60 days of rest, 60 days of leave, yet getting fully paid. Additionally, under the Employment Act 1955, there is a general prohibition on requiring women to perform night work in an industrial or agricultural undertaking. So as we stated earlier, the palm oil industry is an agricultural undertaking, so this prohibition of night work applies. Between the hours of 10 p.m. and 5 a.m., no female employee should be required to work. Okay, so that's another thing to take into consideration. Are you requiring your female employees to work at night? And if so, please take note that that is a non-compliance with the Employment Act, which will invite penalty or fines. A lot of the conversation today had revolved around employment of children in palm oil estates and child labor. I think the first thing that springs to mind when you talk about the employment of children is child labor. As Kamini had stated earlier, they are not the same concept. Child labor is not the same as employment of children. Child labor may be prohibited, but the employment of children is regulated in Malaysia. In Peninsular Malaysia specifically, there is a statute governing the employment of children and young persons, and it is called the Children and Young Persons Employment Act 1966. So this applies to the whole of Peninsular Malaysia and to the Federal Territories, but it does not apply to Sabah and Sarawak, where I believe the problem is more prevalent. Okay, having said that, I think it's still beneficial to go through the Children and Young Persons Employment Act, and we can take a look at its provisions to see whether the broader issues which Kamini had described earlier is now encapsulated within our own local legislation. As Anira had said, ratification of international conventions, including the rights of the child, that is not going to have much practical effect unless those provisions have first been incorporated into local legislation. So under the Children and Young Persons Employment Act 1966, let's look at the definition of a child or young person. A child means a person under the age of 15 years, and a young person means a person who has attained the age of 15 years and under the age of 18. So child is under the age of 15, young person means 15 to 18, okay? Section 1A of the Act says that no child or young person shall be or be required or permitted to be engaged in any hazardous work or any employment other than specific in this section. What this means is, besides the work that's allowed under the statute, children or young persons may not be employed. Hazardous work is defined in the fourth schedule and does not rule out agricultural sectors. Similarly, under the newly added fifth schedule, which lists the type of employment that children are not allowed to engage in, agricultural undertaking is not included. Okay, does this automatically mean that children may be employed in palm oil estates? It does not necessarily mean so, because under the Act, a child may only be engaged in specific categories of work. Firstly, employment involving light work suitable to his capacity in any undertaking carried on by his family. So this is like a family-run business. B, employment in any public entertainment in accordance with the terms and conditions of a license granted in that behalf under this Act. C, employment requiring a child to perform work approved or sponsored by the federal government or government of any state and carried on in any school, training institution, or training vessel. And D, employment as an apprentice under a written apprentice contract approved by the Director General with whom a copy of such contract has been filed. Additionally, the age of admission to light work as specified in paragraph A, as I stated earlier, shall be no less than 13 years. Essentially, what this means is that a child below 13 should not actually be engaged in any type of labor. A child above the age of 13, a child 13 years and above may be engaged in light work. Okay, light work under the Act means work that is not considered to be harmful to his health, mental or physical capacity, or to prejudice his attendance at school, that includes any place which teaches any religion, his participation in vocational orientation or training programs approved by the competent authority, or his capacity to benefit from the instruction received. So a child which engages in light work, you must be careful to ensure that the work is not harmful to his health, mental or physical capacity, and does not prejudice his ability to attend school. So now the thing to consider with palm oil estates is the type of work that the children is doing light work. There has been discussion just now about how some children follow their parents to work. What are they doing? Are they doing the part of work that's light, or are they doing work which should be done by an adult or at least a young person? I think that companies need to take a proactive view on this and not just turn a blind eye in saying, okay, look, a child is following the parents to work, I'm not requiring the child to work. But we need to be proactive and practical about it, because these are things that happen. They have no childcare at home. They have no after school activities to do. So we need to be able to provide them with that kind of protection, simply because due to the circumstances that they live or are born in, they cannot access that type of privilege. Okay. Now, there are also applicable conditions under the Act which must be adhered to. For example, Section 4 of the Act says that no child or young person engaged in any employment shall, in a period of 7 consecutive days, be required or permitted to work for more than 6 days. So easily summarized, this means that in a week of 7 days, they work 6 days. Okay. There are also restrictions on the numbers of hours of work. No child engaged in employment shall be required or permitted to work between the hours of 8 o'clock in the evening, 8 p.m. and 7 a.m. Okay. However, there is an exception for children in an agricultural undertaking. They should also not be required or permitted to work for more than 3 consecutive hours without a period of rest of at least 30 minutes, to work for more than 6 hours in a day, or if the child's attending school for a period which, together with the time he spent attending school, exceeds 7 hours, or to commence work on any day without having had a period of not less than 14 consecutive hours free from work. Whereas for young persons, no young person engaged in any employment shall be required or permitted to work between the hours of 8 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning. Of course, exceptions apply in an agricultural undertaking, to work for more than 4 consecutive hours without a period of rest of at least 30 minutes, to work for more than 7 hours in one day, or if the young person is attending school for a period which, together with the time he spends attending school, exceeds 8 hours, provided that if the young person is an apprentice, the period of work in any one day shall not exceed 8 hours, or to commence work on any day without having had a period of less than 12 consecutive hours free from work. On top of all that, on top of the hours of work which they are required to work and the days of work, it is also important to remember that the provisions of the Employment Act apply to a child or young person that's employed in the same way it applies to an adult. So this means that they still have to be given their wages on time, they still have to be given overtime, they still enjoy the protection from deduction of wages, they still enjoy public holidays or annual leave, they should be given sick leave, hospitalization leave, they are entitled to payment of termination benefits if for any reason their employment is terminated. Okay, so a child and young person, if anything, have an added measure of protection to what the Employment Act already prescribes. Any person which contravenes the provision of the Child and Young Persons Employment Act shall be guilty of an offence and shall be liable on conviction to an imprisonment for a term not exceeding 2 years, or to a fine not exceeding 50,000 ringgit, or to both. And in the case of a second or subsequent offence, there are stricter penalties. So there could be a imprisonment for a term not exceeding 5 years, or a fine not exceeding 100,000 ringgit, or to both. One thing that is also crucial to note is that if the person committing the offence is a body corporate, and the person who is a director, manager may be found liable for the penalty. Okay, so in gist, those are the laws relating to the employment of children and young persons, which relate to work in an agricultural undertaking. And without further ado, I would like to pass it on to Nicholas to talk about the considerations from the East Malaysian perspective.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. Hi, good afternoon everyone. I'm Nicholas Wong from Reddy & Co Advocates. I'm a lawyer practicing in Sarawak. My counterparts in West Malaysia have already provided the law and information applicable to West Malaysia. For my part, I will be sharing some statutory provisions and information which are applicable to the employment of children in Sabah and Sarawak. Although Sabah and Sarawak have different labor ordinances, the relevant provisions in both states for today's topics are almost identical. In fact, the ordinances in East Malaysia, from what I heard from Nera and Sarah a moment ago, are in fact quite similar to Sarawak and Sabah. Okay. The Employment Act 1955 is only applicable in West Malaysia, as we know. Similarly, the Children and Young Persons Employment Act 1966 is also only applicable in West Malaysia. So I will not be repeating all the West Malaysian Act, which are also applicable to East Malaysia. For East Malaysia, we have the Sarawak Labour Ordinance and Sabah Labour Ordinance respectively. Before we go into the Sarawak Labour Ordinance, I would like to draw your attention to another statute which is relevant to our topic, which is the Employees' Minimum Standards of Housing, Accommodation and Amenities Act. I will not go into this in detail as well, as it is applicable throughout Malaysia and not specifically to Sarawak, and I believe it has been covered earlier. Generally, this act makes it mandatory for employer to comply with the minimum standards of housing, accommodations, and amenities for employment, such as to provide the employees with basic water and electricity supply at the workplace. In general, a person is deemed to be an employee under the Sarawak and Sabah Labour Ordinance if his monthly salary are not more than 2,500 ringgit. However, there are some exceptions to this under the schedule of the labour ordinances. I believe the threshold for this is different from West Malaysia. Currently, the minimum monthly wages in Sarawak are 1,200 ringgit and 1,100 ringgit respectively, depending on the areas. According to the Sarawak Minimum Wages Order 2020, the recent one, the minimum wages for the city council area is 1,200 ringgit per month, but the minimum wages for municipal area, which is further away from the city area, is 1,100 ringgit per month. Under the Sabah and Sarawak Labour Ordinance, there is a difference in definition of a child and a young person. Like Sarah has pointed out a moment ago, it is more or less the same. A child means a person under the age of 15 years old, and a young person means a person who has ceased to be a child but has not attained age of 18 years. So the question now is whether a child can be employed in an oil palm estate in Sarawak. I would like to draw your attention to section 73 sub 2 of the Sarawak Labour Ordinance, wherein it provides that the employment in which children and young persons may be engaged. According to this section, a child may only be engaged in the following four situations. A, the first one, employment involving light work suitable to his capacity in any undertaking carried on by his family. B, employment in any public entertainment in accordance with the terms and conditions of a license granted. C, employment requiring him to perform work approved or sponsored by the federal government or the government of any state and carried on in any school, training institution, or training vessel. And lastly, D, employment as apprentice under a written apprenticeship contract. Although there is no express prohibition for a child to work in a oil palm estate, subject to the types of work that a child is required to perform, my view is that Section 73 of the Sarawak Labour Ordinance does not allow a child to be employed for industrial purposes, including plantation, oil palm plantation. The position in Sabah is similar. However, the position of a young person is different. A young person is permitted under Section 73, Sub 3 of the Sarawak Labour Ordinance to carry out various work such as employment in factory and employment in an industrial undertaking suitable to his capacity. Pursuant to Section 73, Sub 5 of the Sarawak Labour Ordinance, no child or young person shall be or be required or permitted to be engaged in any employment contrary to basically two statutes: Factories and Machinery Acts and Electricity Ordinance of Sarawak, or any employment requiring the child to do underground work. So this is also similar to the provisions relating to women's protection. No underground work is allowed. So the only two statutes that is provided under Section 73, Sub 5 of the Sarawak Labour Ordinance, as I mentioned, are the Factories and Machinery Act and Electricity Ordinance. Other than that, there is no express prohibition. For the employment that a child is permitted to undertake, he or she shall not be asked to work for more than 6 days in any period of 7 consecutive days. That is to say, a child cannot be asked to work for more than 6 days in a week. And this is provided under Section 74A of the Sarawak Labour Ordinance. Furthermore, Section 74B of the Sarawak Labour Ordinance states that no child shall be required or permitted to work in 4 scenarios: A, between 8 p.m. to 7 a.m., B, more than 3 consecutive hours more than 3 consecutive hours without a period of rest for at least 30 minutes, C, more than 6 hours per day, or if the child is attending school for a period which, together with the time he spends attending school, exceeds 7 hours, or D, to commence work on any day without having had a period of not less than 14 consecutive hours free of work. In fact, these provisions are quite similar with the provisions under the Employments Act 1955 of West Malaysia. Some people may ask this question: can a child or children enter into an employment contract which may run foul or at odds with the provision in the Contracts Act? The answer is yes, by virtue of Section 75B of the Sarawak Labour Ordinance. A child or young person shall be competent to enter into any contract of service under this ordinance. In fact, a child can even sue as a plaintiff for breach of the employment contract as against the employer. So the above are some pertinent provisions relating to employment of children in Sarawak, which is quite simple. We do not have a very comprehensive legislation like the West Malaysia 1966 Act, the Children and Young Person Employment Act. So at the moment, the Act has not been extended to Sabah and Sarawak. We do not have such comprehensive legislation apart from the Sarawak and Sabah Labour Ordinance, and also the prohibition under the Factories, Machinery, Electricity Ordinance, and the OSHA Act. Another important area to know before any employment can be made for non-Sarawakian is the immigration law concerning the East Malaysian state under the Immigration Act. Section 66 of the Immigration Act restricts citizens. Citizen here, I'm referring to Malaysian citizen. Section 66 restricts citizens' right of entry into East Malaysian state, which includes Sabah and Sarawak. A citizen shall not be entitled to enter an East Malaysian state without having first obtained a permit or pass, unless he or she falls within the exceptions. For example, he belongs to the East Malaysian state, or if he is a member of the federal government or state legislative assembly. The question of who can be considered as a person belonging to East Malaysian state is answered in Section 71 of the Immigration Act. It does not mean that a person must be born in Sarawak for him to be treated as a person belonging to the East Malaysian state. For example, someone who has a status of PR, permanent status of Sarawak, or a woman who is married to a PR of Sarawak can be treated as belonging to an East Malaysian state for this purpose. In brief, employees outside Sarawak will need to obtain entry permit and employment pass for Sarawak from the Sarawak state government for any employment within the state. Based on my knowledge, the only foreign workers that the Sarawak state government currently approved to work in oil palm industry are from Indonesia. I believe this is different from West Malaysia. And also from my understanding, almost all of the oil palm companies in Sarawak employ mostly Indonesian workers in their state, as opposed to Malaysian workers or other foreign workers. I was told that officially only Indonesian workers are allowed to work in the oil palm industry or the agriculture industry in Sarawak. However, there could be exceptions which are not within my knowledge, can be changed from time to time. I understand that some oil palm companies in Sarawak expressly state in the employment contract with the foreign workers that they are not permitted to bring any dependent into Sarawak. They cannot bring their wife, they cannot bring their children, failing which it will be a breach of the employment contract and they will not be allowed to continue with the employment. So this would mean that women and children are not found in large number in the oil palm estate in Sarawak. So this is applicable to oil palm companies in Sarawak where they employ large number of foreign workers. For today's speech, I am not covering areas which may be relevant to native customary rights. Those are mostly workers involving local farmers. Those are mostly the small estate holders. I will not be covering that in today's topic. So with that, I will conclude my speech for today. If there's any question, I am happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, Anira, and Sarah, for a very, very insightful session. We're going to now start picking up some of the questions for Q&A. Audience members, if you do have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box so we can pick them up as we go along. What I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to kickstart with a couple of questions of my own. And this is because obviously Sarah and Anira and Nicholas, you've covered different aspects of the legislation for different jurisdictions. So I think when I ask these questions, I'm just going to make them quite general. And then, any of you, if you're inclined to answer, please jump in. I think my first question is around sort of enforcement. How effective is enforcement in this space where we're talking about child rights in, palm oil plantations? And is there a role that in-house counsel plays in managing such events?
I think I'll attempt to take that one. I think that sadly, enforcement is lax. Enforcement is lacking or lax. And most of the time, enforcement comes when there's a complaint or a whistleblower. So one example we can take into account is, the Employee Minimum Standards of Housing Act, which was briefly touched on by Nicholas earlier on. Before the changes to that act, it was called the Workers Minimum Standard Housing Act. And the changes that spearheaded today is as a result of the kind of whistleblowing that came around these large corporations in the wake of COVID-19. The changes came so swiftly and so extensively because there's so much attention, so much media attention, so much international attention. And I think, it wouldn't be any different with the palm oil. A lot of these workers are invisible, and a lot of them are sidelined. So, that there are frequent immigration raids to ensure that immigration laws are complied with. But as far as employment laws are concerned, I think, an investigation will only be kickstarted once there's a complaint or some kind of fire around that. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Nicholas or Anira, did you have anything you wanted to share in that space? If not, I will jump to the next question. Okay, I think I'll jump to the next question. This question specifically is for Nicholas. And the question is, are the Sabah and Sarawak labor ordinances undergoing the process of public consultation for the purposes of amendment? The person who submitted this question was, I believe, informed that this began in 2018-2019, and is wondering if there are any updates on that to date. Would you be able to take that, please, Nicholas?
Yes, I'm not aware of the latest amendment since 2018 and 19. I will have to check on that.
Sure thing, no worries.
Yes, as far as I know, subsidiary legislations have been amended in 2008. And since then, there is no major amendment to the Sarawak Labor Ordinance. If there's any specific areas in the Labor Ordinance which you want to ask, perhaps you can let me know. I'll see whether that provision is still applicable or it has been amended. Based on what I have, it has not been updated for a long time.
All right, thank you for that, Nicholas. I think we've got one more question. We talked a little bit earlier, I believe Anira mentioned this, that there may be stricter regulations in the future. Is there any indication from anybody on the panel? Do we know what those things may look like, and if there's a timeline around that? Or is this, something that's on the ground and in progress, but we're not really sure at this stage?
Hi, I think I can take that.
Thanks, Anira.
At the moment, no, it's a goal, and of course there's a lot of grassroots level stuff that is coming up, and it really helps when there's a public outcry about certain issues, especially to do with migrants and the various issues surrounding them. There are expected changes to the Employment Act. There are supposed to be more protective changes generally to labor laws as a whole. But in respect of child protection, I don't think that there's anything that is coming anytime soon, or maybe I can't remember if there is anything. There was recently the Sexual Offences Against Children Act that came into force, and the Sexual Offenders Registry that came into force. Even that is that registry is not a complete one. Last I checked, I think there was only about a couple of thousand names. It's not in any way comprehensive, but certainly moves are being taken to protect issues surrounding child protection, such as child pornography, child trafficking. There are a lot of people on the ground that are working on it from in different ways and from different perspectives. In terms of new legislation coming up, I don't think that there's anything in the works at the moment.
Thanks very much for that, Anira. We do have another question that's popped into the Q&A box. Thank you for asking this. The question is, are young persons allowed to work on rest days? I think this answer possibly may differ depending on whether you're looking at East or West Malaysia. Can anyone from the panel take that question by chance?
I'll take you from the West Malaysia perspective because that's the only perspective I can take.
Thanks, Sarah.
A young person, no worker is supposed to be working on the rest day, including young persons. If you want them to be working on a rest day, you have to be paying them the pay that's commensurate with the rest day pay. Okay, having said that, remember that under the Children and Young Persons Act, a child or young person cannot work 7 consecutive days. Okay.
Great, thanks. Sarah, there's actually a follow-up to this. So the second part of this question, and you may have addressed this to some extent, if workers consent to work on rest days and they're paid the relevant wage rate, does that constitute a form of forced labor?
No, it does not. So work on rest days do occur. But you have to ensure that they are properly compensated for that and they're not forced to do it.
Great, thank you so much. Nicholas, would you be able to address this for me? Great, thank you so much.
The position of rest day is similar to West Malaysia as well. If any employee or child is required to work on a rest day, double wages will have to be paid. And it cannot be forced, it must be voluntary.
Great, thank you so much. I think we're going to wrap up our Q&A here. Thank you again to our speakers, Anira, Sarah, and Nicholas. It's been great having you on board. It's been great working with you. Thank you so much for taking the time to attend today and to share your knowledge with the rest of us. Next, I'm going to move on to introducing our next speaker, and for our final session of the afternoon, we have Linda from Earthworm Foundation with our closing session on ways forward, child risk assessment, and engaging stakeholders. Now, Linda leads the Children in Plantation program at the Earthworm Foundation for Malaysia. In her role, Linda supports palm oil producers in protecting the interests and well-being of children in plantations. She has worked in various positions for the UN systems in Timor-Leste, Pakistan, Egypt, and Indonesia to address gender and protection issues. At the ASEAN CSR network in Singapore, Linda worked with regional business networks to implement social responsibilities and to address human rights in labor practices. She's also served at ASLI CPPS and East-West One Group in Malaysia. Linda holds a master's degree in mission and development practice from the University of Wales in the UK. And with this extensive experience under her belt, Linda will be walking you through child risk assessment and engaging stakeholders in this space. Over to you, Linda.
Thank you, Shini, for the introduction. My warmest greetings to everyone who's present in this webinar. It's my pleasure to be with you today. I hope everyone is doing well amidst of the CMO, MCO, or RMCO. As you have heard from the previous speakers, companies have an important role to play in protecting the interests and well-being of children in plantations. The MSPO and RSPO standards, including the minimum standards of the national legislations, do require companies to provide protections to children on plantations. Stakes are high if child protection issues are not addressed in your company's operations, and you may be at risk at fine penalties, legal sanctions, or suffer from reputational damage. In my presentation today, I would like to draw your attention on how companies can comply to the child rights protection standards in safeguarding the interests of children in plantations through child risk assessment process, as well as engaging stakeholders. Next slide, please. Before I focus my presentation on child risk assessment, I thought it would be appropriate for me to give you a brief overview on the involvement of Earthworm Foundation's Children's and Plantations program and key child rights issue to set the context of my presentation. Right, children in plantations. The phrase children in plantations do normally give us a negative connotations, but we know that the presence of children in plantations does not necessarily mean that they are involved in child labor. However, the risk of child labor is widely acknowledged regardless of the size of the plantation. Since 2017, as you have seen from the slide, EF has been supporting industry-wide efforts to improve the well-being of children in palm oil plantations in Sabah, Malaysia. We have organized a series of consultations in year 2017 and year 2018 with small, medium, and large companies, mostly plantations and mills operating on the east coast of Sabah. as well as with civil societies, to better understand the situations of children living in plantations, to clarify national legislations, and explore how palm oil companies can ensure child labor-free supply chain. So based on our consultations with these companies and civil societies, EF also realized palm producers needed some resources. So in 2018 and 2019, we developed a directory to connect companies with third-party organizations, namely service providers that provide services to children in plantations. We aim to pave the way for better collaboration among businesses, civil societies, government agencies, and other service providers and stakeholders in Sabah. This directory offers information to companies on which actors actually provide what type of services in which particular location in Sabah to children in plantations. In 2020, we developed the Child Risk Assessment Framework, in which I'm going to focus my presentation on this. Next slide, please. To set the context, it will be useful to first understand what are the key child rights issues faced by children in plantation. Firstly, among the 3 regions in Malaysia, I would like to draw your attention to Sabah. Sabah is the biggest palm oil producing state in Malaysia. It holds the highest number of migrant workers. According to the statistics provided by the Immigration Department, there are more than 300,000 of migrant workers that exist in Sabah, with 85% of them are Indonesians, followed by 15% are the Filipinos. Due to porous borders, like what Dr. Catherine has just mentioned, Sabah has a large population of undocumented workers and their children are namely. The hiring of undocumented workers has implications for their children. Fear of arrest due to their undocumented status, resulting in these workers being reluctant or unable to send their children to alternative learning centers. This subsequently increases the likelihood of children engaging in plantation work. Being an undocumented person makes them even more vulnerable to exploitation. In Malaysia, we know that foreigners cannot be enrolled in national schools, regardless of whether one is documented or not. As far as we're concerned, some well-established larger operations, plantation companies, do operate schools for children of their workers, including migrants. But the same cannot be said for many other small, medium enterprise plantations where irregular or undocumented migrants and children live and work. Children in plantations are also more vulnerable because of the geographical location, as most of them are located in remote area. And many communities have to travel at least 3 to 4 hours along the logging roads to reach to the nearest clinic for emergency services. For some companies, there are also gaps in the overall quality of services, especially for children in rural areas and marginalized communities. And many of them do not have birth certificate due to difficulty in accessing registration office, as also that it's further compounded by high illiteracy among their parents on the importance of birth cert. The second point that I would like to raise here is that while some companies have made great achievement in managing and addressing the issues associated with children in plantations, there are still key issues and challenges that companies face based on our interactions with them in 2017 and 2018. Small, medium-sized companies told EF that they have limited knowledge and awareness of what is permissible and non-permissible work for children and young people, according to the national legislation in Malaysia, and they have insufficient guidance for legal compliance. Equally important is the lack of awareness among the workers themselves regarding the potential health implications towards their children and whether or not the children should be involved in plantation work and the hazardous work in particular. Thirdly, family work is seen as culturally acceptable in most of the Asian countries. The low wages of working parents cause children and young persons to be at risk at being mobilized by their parents to assist them to produce higher outputs to earn enough money to live. These children may be involved in collecting loose fruits, harvesting, manuring, and loading fresh fruit branches. Fourthly, the limited scope of legal protection for migrant workers and children in Malaysia. This group of people, they have to rely on general laws to claim protection. Hence, it can be said that the existing legal framework is insufficient of granting, namely women and children in plantations, the protections guaranteed in international standards. It is in this context, Earthworm Foundation has developed a project that focuses specifically on child risk assessment to help palm oil producers to identify issues and develop solutions to protect the rights of children in plantation. Next slide, please. What is child risk assessment? In this project, EF supports companies to ask difficult questions on what is it in your plantations and mills that can potentially harm the well-being of children and young people, which will then affect your company to comply with the minimum standards of the law and the child protection standards, as well as your buyer's expectation. It's about identifying the risk factors that are internally and externally present in your operations. It's about encouraging companies to ask questions like what could go wrong so that you could control the situation before any accidents or ill health occur. What is the likelihood that this risk will cause harm that could impede children's growth and development process and make my workers unhappy and being unproductive? And how will this risk impact my company's reputation, financial liability, and continuity of business operations? Well, functional managers, staff workers, contractors, suppliers, and children are your partners in identifying risks and developing strategies to address child risk. But please note that it is strongly recommended that if you are interacting with children in plantations, in interviewing them, you need to engage organizations or individuals that has established experience working with children when interviewing children to ensure that the best interest of the child principle is safeguarded. Child risk assessment requires investment. There must be strong commitment from top management. You need to be investing time, money, and human resources. You need good information from various sources to be able to identify potential problems and the appropriate solutions. Everyone in your company has a role to play, from identifying risks to coming up with the appropriate actions plans and to mitigate and to address child risk. Next slide, please. If you're interested to know more on how child risk assessment is being conducted, these slides give you an overview of the 8 steps you can take to conduct child risk assessment. First, familiarize yourself with the market and certification requirements, including the national legislation or what is expected for companies to comply with. Second is to assess under what conditions your plantations and mills are operating, and this can form your baseline studies. Thirdly, to identify what is it in your plantations that could potentially harm the well-being of children and young people. Step 4, assess what is the likelihood of this hazard in causing harm and injury to children and young people. Step 5, you can assess the consequences of harm and injury to children, young people, and to your company. Step 6, conduct a risk rating to prioritize your action plan. For example, if you're working for a small, medium-sized company and you only have limited human resources and financial resources to invest in improving the life of children in plantations, who are those children? And in what particular area that you would like to invest in? And where it would have the greatest impact in improving the life of children? Where would you like to spend your money on? This is where the risk rating assessment will help you to prioritize your action plans. You can consult third-party organizations such as civil societies to help you with this assessment. Okay, after step 6 is the step for you to develop a corrective action plan to remediate the issues faced and to be followed by the monitoring processes to see the extent to which the actions that you have put in place is actually producing effective and positive effects on the lives of the children. Next slide, please. To conduct child risk assessment, EF has developed a toolkit titled Child Risk Assessment Framework. This is a diagnostic toolkit. It's not a performance measurement toolkit. It is meant for companies to understand the gaps in compliance in meeting child protection criteria and standards, as well as the minimum standards outlined in the national legislation. As such, this tool should be seen as step 1 in your journey of continuous improvement for child protection. The real value of this tool is that this exercise will help to review gaps that will lead to the development of a risk management plan and continuous monitoring. It covers issues such as child labor, safety for young workers, maternity protection, healthcare and nutrition, birth registration, child sexual exploitation and abuse, on-site safety, water and sanitation. It's a holistic toolkit that covers a range of issues. This toolkit has 2 main parts. The first part are guidelines on what companies can do to prevent and to mitigate specific type of risks faced by children and young people in plantations, and how to remediate harm and address gaps in your system and processes to prevent issues from happening again. It also highlights the relevant national legislation that concerns children in plantations that you might be interested to look at. The second section contains of assessment criteria that companies can use to self-assess your practices in the prevention and mitigation of risks. Ideally, companies are strongly recommended to work closely with third-party organizations or service providers that have technical expertise in child protection, children's education, early childhood, gender-based violence, to implement these guidelines and to conduct self-assessment in these two kits. It's available online, it's for free. You may be asking, what is it in for my company if I were to use this toolkit? Well, this toolkit will help your company first to establish a baseline and assess the overall capacity of your companies in complying to child protection criteria and standards, and to indicate where you stand in terms of safeguarding child rights in your operations. Second, it will help you to better identify the risk factors that contribute to the vulnerability of children plantations. Third, it could help you to identify priority areas for intervention based on risk rating. Fourth, it will guide you to develop a corrective action plan on how to remediate the issues. EF has secured actually 2 pilot sites to test out this tool with a company in Sabah. In this pilot testing project, it involves EF provides training to company on how to conduct child risk assessment and how to use this toolkit. EF facilitates company to conduct child risk assessment on plantation sites and provide data-driven analysis on how to strengthen child protection based on the child risk assessment conducted, as well as connecting companies with relevant key stakeholders. Next slide, please. Well, you may be thinking to yourself, well, can I really solve the problem of children in plantation by just conducting a child risk assessment? Is it as simple as this? Well, we all know that child protection, particularly in the state of Sabah and in the palm oil industry, is a systemic, delicate, and complicated issue, which is beyond what a company can do. And many of the root causes that leads to child protection issues requires intervention from government agencies, civil societies, workers, children, and communities. The needs of children in plantation are vast, and it's impossible to address those risks and needs. I have a message for you today. You're not alone. We're not expecting companies to do this alone, as it requires a collaborative approach with various stakeholders. As outlined in the slide, this could be the prospective stakeholders that you might want to consider working with. For example, with the government agencies or government department. You can consider engaging with them. It will be a good way for you to understand the existing support mechanisms that are present in the local community that you're operating in, and can help you to create a better experience for your workers and your families. And their families, sorry. And you can capitalize on your relationship with suppliers, recruitment agencies, service providers, and your contractors to shed light on the vulnerabilities of workers and children in your mill and plantations. And we encourage you to have continuous dialogues with your workers themselves through town hall meetings. This will enable you to get to know your workers and their families better and build your understanding of their needs. With that knowledge, you are able to anticipate the potential problems related to workers' rights as well as the well-being of their families. And of course, the children's well-being as well. So these workers can tell you the sources of their hardship that they face at work, including the hardship faced by their family members. So they are more than any other key stakeholder groups. They hold a key question to finding effective ways to address the issues. And children and young people are the main key stakeholders as well. Children normally don't give their views. They don't express their opinions. And yet children might be having more important information than adults. Children may witness something that the parents or adults may not. If we don't sit down and talk with these children, we may miss that piece of very important information. For example, conversations with children produce detailed information on the various tasks children perform, the time that they spend on these activities, the hazards involved, and whether their working activities interfere with their schooling or health. Well, in dealing with children again, I would like to reiterate that you may wish to engage child protection experts in your engagement with them to ensure that the principle of do no harm and the best interest of the child is being applied. As you can see from the slide also, EF has developed the Directory of Services for Vulnerable Children. This is a resource tool that has been developed to help companies to improve the welfare of children in plantations. And in this directory, it offers a mapping of who provides what and in where of the potential services for vulnerable children, including access to alternative education, community engagement, birth registration, initiative, and other related services. It's available in English and in Malay languages, and it's available on EF website. Well, you may wonder what's next after listening to my presentation. It's pretty simple, yeah. There are 3 action items that you may wish to consider doing if you're not. First, you can find out, right after this webinar, if your company do actually have a child protection policy. If your company do have a child protection policy, so you might to probe a little bit more on what are the government structure, policies, and practices that has been put in place to ensure that child protection is also included as part of your risk management plan. Secondly, you can conduct child risk assessment. Third, you can start developing partnership with different key stakeholders to synergize your effort in protecting children in plantations. You may have done that very well, and you might think of strengthening your partnerships with various key stakeholders. I know that not all palm producers company here are at the same level of learning curve. Some of you may have just started to realize the importance of addressing child rights and child protection in your operations. And there may be some of you who have already put in place certain governance, structures, policies, practices to safeguard children's interests in plantations and need further input to fine-tune your practices. No matter where you are, if you think that you need technical support from Earthworm Foundation to improvise your operations, please feel free to contact us and we are there to support you. Well, ladies, next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the close of this webinar. On behalf of EF's, special thanks goes to LexisNexis for all their hospitality and support. I also wish to extend my deep appreciation to MPIC, AJ Chowdhury, Instate Consultancy, Etania Schools Sabah, Reddy & Co. Advocates, since Crime, whose guidance has helped to ensure that this webinar will be remembered as a high point in the history of Earthworm Foundation and LexisNexis. I also want to thank all participants for your valuable contributions to our successful webinar. I wish you a pleasant afternoon and thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Linda. On behalf of LexisNexis Southeast Asia, we want to thank Earthworm Foundation for being such engaged and insightful partners to work with. On behalf of all of us here today from both our organizations, we want to thank Gayatri and Carl. Thank you for setting the tone with your opening remarks. Mr. Lechmanan Shanmugam from the Ministry of Plantation, Industries and Commodities for delivering our keynote address this morning. And our esteemed panelists, Dr. Catherine, Kamini, Anira, Sarah, Nicholas, and of course, Linda, for taking the time to share your knowledge with us today. Last but not least, you, the audience, for your commitment to advancing the rule of law and for engaging with us today. We thank you. We hope to see you again at future webinars like this one. Now, if you'd like any more information on anything that has been shared today or further information on future events, please do drop us and Earthworm an email. The information should be up on your screen right now. Thank you, everyone, and have a great weekend ahead or great week ahead.